Over the past 20 years, we've made substantial progress in understanding the role of the microbiome in IBD. We now recognize that it is central to inflammation in IBD. A lot of the genes that have been found to be linked with IBD over the past 20 years all deal with various aspects of how the body responds to the microbiome, how it recognizes the microbiome, how it responds to the microbiome. And so we recognize that microbiome is a central player for inflammation in IBD. There are a number of external influences that influence the microbiome, of which one of the most dominant one is diet. So if you look at most studies that have looked at what are all the external factors, whether it's medication, whether it's other exposures, and diet, it seems fairly consistent that diet is an important determinant of the microbial composition. So there are, in the United States, about 3 million people we estimate with IBD, about half with Crohn's and half with ulcerative colitis, about, just under 1% of the population. And, that is a similar number in Europe, around 3 to 4 million people in Europe. In a lot of countries, Canada has a similar prevalence as the US, for example. So you multiply the Canadian population by the same number. But then you also look globally at places where there are the population, the incidence may be lower, but the number of cases will be substantially higher, right? So let's say in India and China, the population is 1 billion people. So even if the prevalence of IBD is a fraction of that in the US, a quarter of that in the US, or a tenth of that in the US, that's still a large number of people with IBD globally. And most studies have shown that there continues to be an increase in IBD over time in all of these regions, including the United States. If you look at IBD and what we've understood so far, we've uncovered over 300 potential genetic variants that are associated with IBD. But if you put them all together, they still explain only about 30% at the most of why people get Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So still the vast majority of why people get these conditions remains unexplained, except perhaps in large part by the environment. In studies that have looked at environmental factors, for example, up to 40-50% of disease onset can be explained by various environmental influences. Environmental influences right from the time of conception, certainly from the time of birth, environmental influences are critically important. Multiple studies have shown that children who are breastfed have a lower risk of developing IBD over time than people who are not. Antibiotic exposure in early life, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, is also associated with increased risk of IBD that studies have shown fairly consistently. The earlier you are exposed to antibiotics, the more you are exposed to antibiotics. Both of those seem to make a difference. Smoking, cigarette smoking is a very important risk factor for IBD as well, in that if you're smoking, you're double your risk of getting Crohn's disease. And if you have Crohn's and you continue smoking, you increase your risk of permanent complications and surgery. Obesity is associated with a slightly higher risk of IBD throughout sort of childhood. Physical activity has been linked to lower risk of IBD. So it's interesting that there are a number of these environmental factors, a lot of which have a number of other health benefits as well, beyond just potentially their effect on IBD. But there are a number of factors that have been linked.